Hey everyone, welcome back to the All Natural Horse Podcast. I'm your host Laurel, and today we're continuing our discussion with Shelby Dennis regarding ethics in horse racing. If you haven't listened to the first episode, go ahead and click that back button. It'll give you some more context into what we're talking about today. The Kentucky Derby just ended, and I think we were all collectively holding our breaths for the horses and riders out there. They entered the starting gate, got through the whole race, everything was clean. But I think a lot of us, myself included, were having flashbacks to last year where 12 horses died, lost their lives with the gambling in this race. It's kind of insane when you're thinking about it. Why are there so many deaths at racetracks? What makes these breakdowns so disastrous? And can anything be done to make this sport more ethical and safer overall for the horses? Let's get into it. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty, what everybody wants to hear about. On average, in the U.S., every 1,000 starts is going to have about 1.5 horse deaths. Where are these deaths coming from? Is this sort of a conflated statistic where there's so many horses that that's not that many? And what is the difference between that and other horse sports?
So between that and other horse sports, it's kind of hard to say because they don't track them, and a lot of the horses in other sports will become like really injured in the show ring maybe, but then they die like outside of it. Like they're brought home to be euthanized and you never hear about it again, or they just drop off the face of the map. Like I would say with show jumping, there's that whole scandal where people were killing horses for insurance money, and there's that guy that was like literally a horse hitman who would go around and kill them in ways that made it look like an accident.
I hadn't heard about that. That's crazy.
It's insane. He'd shock them with a car battery and cause them to go into cardiac arrest so that there is no there is no proof that they had been killed.
Wow.
With like for that purpose of committing insurance fraud. And I'm sure people do that in other disciplines too. Like I wouldn't be surprised if people did the same thing to expensive racehorses who weren't breeding candidates and also couldn't race. With that said, like it is hard to make a comparison to other disciplines because we can't compare the deaths because other disciplines aren't held accountable in the same way. Similarly though with racing, like if the horse breaks down and manages to walk off the track and then they get like euthanized off of the racetrack, it's not going to be counted as a breakdown on the track. So the death toll could be higher than what it's said to be. I think collectively in all horse sports, the amount of horses that we fatally break down or permanently maim and cause lifelong lamenesses and chronic issues is a lot higher than what most people would be comfortable admitting. With racing, I do think the number that people hear about them is inflated because of the sheer volume of horses running worldwide. Like it is a massively larger industry than any other horse industry. So that's part of it for sure. A lot of people at the racetrack, if you ask them about breakdowns, they'll say that it was like a freak accident, that it was a misstep, that the horse like tripped, they did this, they did that. No, that's not why. It's not a freak freak accidents happen out of the blue every now and then. They're not like a yearly occurrence, even with that type of sample size. I'm sure maybe a small portion of breakdowns are actually a freak accident where maybe the track surface is breaking down and the horse stepped in the one singular hole in the racetrack. In my opinion, I think it's the result of overtraining in a lot of cases where people aren't listening to earlier signs that their horse is uncomfortable because they ignore all the behavioral signs. They just want to keep trucking along and keep the horse training. So they keep pushing them along when there's probably earlier signs that the horse is having physical issues, not necessarily in a way where they're completely lame, but where there's just like maybe some fill in the legs, some heat in the legs, their behavior changing while they're running, back pain or something. And they ignore those and they keep running. And then the micro fractures that have been building up in this leg or like the micro tears of the tendons, when they're running at that piece, it can suddenly just blow. It's like an elastic band. Once you stretch it to a certain point, it's just going to snap. And then then it kind of is like this big catastrophic issue. So I think that is part of it. So they're overtraining, they're not prepping the horses well enough, and that's the overtraining is also going to be contributed to by the tension in the muscles, the chronic stress, and how expensive stress is on the body. Like I do think stress makes horses more predisposed to lamenesses. I cannot support that from a study on horses, but I know that with humans, chronic stress causes all sorts of health issues, including autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis and other stuff. So like we know with humans that stress can manifest into physical issues. I think that it can be the same with horses personally. The other issue is that I think how bad the track farriery is contributes to breakdowns, because a lot of the horses who are running have really low collapsed underrun heels and long toes, and it creates a lever effect on their legs, and every step they take is going to be more damaging than it would be if the general composition of their feet was better. Also, the use of shoes with no frog support tends to cause caudal failure, and then they aren't able to use the shock absorbing structures of their feet as effectively, and then that shock is just going to go ricocheting up the legs and the joints, and the ligaments are going to have to take more impact. And then I also think the half tree saddles contribute to it, because they effectively clamp down on the wither, and then their scapula is ramming into the half tree of the saddle with every stride, and they're probably going to change how they move to accommodate that discomfort over time, and then they can end up they can take more wear and tear on the body. And then I also think that the fact that they are constantly running the same direction, and that a lot of trainers don't train their horses the other direction, like not even at like the trot, because like you can backtrack them at the trot and stuff. A lot of people don't want to do that, especially with the difficult horses, because they can freak out when they have horses running at them the other way. And so, like, if racetracks started to do where it's like 3 days a week you did going to the left, and then the other 3 you go to the right, like, I think that they'd notice less injuries by default, because you're not building just one side of the body. And, like, yeah, most of the work they do is on straight lines and big sweeping corners, but it still makes a difference, even if it's just off of the rider's imbalance. So I think it's all of those things, plus the fact that, like, of course, when you're starting horses young, especially when you're overtraining them, like, their bodies are more fragile. If they weren't overtraining all of these babies, their bodies would probably be more resilient. But a lot of trainers do too much too soon, too fast, and they don't listen to signs when the horse's body and mind are telling them, like, hey, like, I'm struggling and I need to slow down. And then you have these catastrophic events happen.
Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense. It's easy to point fingers at one single thing being the cause for these catastrophic breakdowns and these deaths on the track. Like, it's because the horses were started young, or it's because of this, it's because of that. But really, like you just said, like, there's so many things that can go into it, and just because there's a correlation between two things, that doesn't mean there's causation. I mean, more murders happen in the summer and more ice cream sales happen in the summer, and those two things have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of research to really discover the definitive cause behind things, but
Yeah, and I think leaving it just down to the age is also a problem. Like that, and again, I think the racing age should be moved so that they have to start later in life. But even if they do that, I don't think that they're necessarily going to see the difference in breakdowns that people think it would bring because of those other issues. So I think the nuance and how many different problems there are contributing that need addressing is important, because if we actually want to make like a really big sweeping change that brings the greatest amount of good, like, we need to look at all of those factors.
right. Yeah, like you just said, like, nuance is really the biggest thing. I try not to have a black and white view of everything. There's shades of gray and everything surrounding horses. So, of course, being informed by science and research and informing my personal opinions based on that, but it is so important. So in your opinion, do we need to do away with racing fully, like some people say, or are there some changes that we can make to it, take it in a more positive direction, make it more horse friendly? Where can we realistically start with that? Like, what is the first step?
I think the first step should be altering the barns to accommodate more species appropriate living situations, and then also at least like bumping the start age up to 3 years old, so that there's no reason for people to be like sitting on their horses at all before 2. And like that's still very young, so I know a lot of people would still have a problem with it, but I think that if you did it too quickly and you suddenly bumped it to 4 years old, that people would freak out and there'd be like a huge amount of backlash and outcry, and it wouldn't be received as well. So I think that those two things would be good. And then I also think that they need to change rules to start allowing people to run their horses barefoot and bitless. And I think that it needs to be viewed through the perspective where it's like, if your horse is out of control, even if they're in a bit, that's a problem. If your horse is out of control and they're bitless, that's a problem. But if they are being safe and riding well and they're not being a problem, who cares? And same thing with the shoes. If your horse is not tripping and slipping and losing traction and being endangered, who cares if they're barefoot? And because I do think that running barefoot would also prevent a lot of injuries, because I think that shoes and how we generally care for horses' feet causes a lot of problems. And like with the race horses too, the other issue with the shoe is that you're effectively putting like a metal brace on a growing foot, and it will disrupt the growth of the coffin bone. So you need to either reevaluate the materials being used for their feet and do ones that have way more give to them, so that they're not going to disrupt the growth and development of the horse's coffin bone. Or we need to be like, okay, let's leave horses barefoot, because also the footing on the track is so good that it's like, if your horse actually has healthy hooves and isn't having problems, they should not be lame on the track. But that's a whole nother story, because of the high starch diets too. They might be footsore.
If any of these topics are interesting to you and you're the kind of person who just loves learning everything they can about horses and is obsessed with your relationship with your horse, go ahead and check out our free ebook at AHLERI.com. That's AHLERI.com. After this episode ends, to download our ebook titled Developing a Deep Friendship with Your Horse. In this ebook, we discuss the many common struggles that horse owners face when it comes to bonding with their horse, and how you can get your fairy tale dream relationship with your faithful equine companion.
So those would be two big things that I'd like to see change. With that said, like, I personally don't see a need to ban and end racing completely, because I do think, like, if we did a ban and end for racing completely for transparency's sake and just for consistency and lack of hypocrisy, I think all competitive horse sports need to go, because they have the same types of corruption and issues. And racing at its core, with the act of running and how short-lived it is, if we change the factors that contribute the most to the problems, it would be one of the most ethical sports, in my opinion, because teaching a horse to run in a straight line involves far less steps than like teaching them how to jump an entire course or teaching them how to run like a reining pattern, etc. Like it's less complicated and it involves less training hours. They could literally even do it with or without a rider. So even if it's like a short-lived amount of low stress at best, like if that's all we could do, where it wasn't even like a neutral or happy experience for them, I think that it would be less than the stress that like hauling a horse around to shows all over the world to go jump 1.60 m would be, if I'm being honest. So if people decided that racing is irreparably damaged and cannot be done ethically under any circumstances, then I think we need to seriously look at how much that applies to all of the other horse sports. Because if we truly believe that, then there's a lot of other things that we shouldn't be enabling continuing to do with horses. I think if we address the main problems in racing, that it would be substantially more ethical than a lot of the other competitive horse sports that people seem to be more protective of, just because the nature of training that behavior is a lot easier. Like with positive reinforcement, you can train these things called A to Bs, which is essentially teaching your horse to go from point A to point B, and you can train them to do it at different paces, and that's literally like what you would be teaching them to do to run a race. And it would be like very easy and very little steps. It would just be about building speed and duration, and it would be easier than trying to teach a horse to be comfortable jumping all sorts of different jumps, because every time you move your horse to a new facility or there's new looking jumps, it's like a new thing to them. So yeah, if we fix the primary issues, I think that it could be one of the most ethical horse sports.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if we took your ideal situation for racing, everyone is training in the most ethical manner, the horses are in a perfectly natural environment, where would we end up? What would the ultimate goal look like?
I think that, like, if it was done properly, it should essentially look like where if you went to the racetrack, the racehorses being like exercised would look like a really well-trained show horse who's like relaxed, like stretching their neck, using their back properly, just loping along calmly. And when they're asked for speed, they offer it, but that they're not these pent up, wired, reactive creatures. And ideally, like a situation where it's like they either go home from the track after training and just go and get turned out in a herd, or we start to move towards socializing them in shared fence lines with in and out paddocks, and then moving towards starting to develop facilities that actually have space for group turnout, especially if we move towards having horses who are barefoot, and then just having each trainer where they could have in and out paddocks and then like a larger turnout area behind the facility. And it would be hard to do initially, and it would involve a lot of changes, but like you said, like there's a lot of money in racing. It is a gambling sport. The government is involved because of that, because it has to go through like it's like like here in BC, it's like the BC Gaming Commission that like governs it. And the casinos that own and run the facilities typically just care about the money. They don't care about the horses. But racing still is a big pull for gambling, and it's the reason why a lot of people choose the casinos that are at racetracks. So the money is there. They have the money. The casinos have the ability to do it, and I think that if people started to view it through the lens of pressuring the absolute crap out of these casinos and these gambling organizations, because they are where the biggest money is, pressuring them to build more ethical areas for the horses to live and holding those huge multi-billion-dollar corporations way more accountable. I think that would be a good way to look at it, because the average racehorse trainer, even if they really wanted that change, like they can't change the general makeup and function of a facility that they don't own. And then the average racehorse trainer doesn't necessarily have their own farm to take horses back to. So for changing the actual layout of the tracks, I think that people need to target these big gambling corporations that either own or are renting the land that these tracks are on. And then I also think that we essentially need to make an example of the really big name trainers who are doing shady stuff, like drugging the crap out of their horses, like Bob Baffert. Like I think that he needs to be martyred, not like by literally killing him, but like I think that his career needs to be destroyed and that he needs to be thrown under the bus. Yeah, like just yeah, destroy him. Yeah, execute him socially, destroy his career. Right now he's too big for his britches. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks he's like the man, and he thinks he can get away with whatever he wants. And honestly, he's not wrong right now. So someone needs to be voted into power in like a place higher up in racing. And like it is a problem because also across state lines, like there's different rules and different people in charge. So it gets muddied. It's not as easy to like regulate for that reason, but also like it is like all of the races are like the jockey club is like the governing organization for like thoroughbred like the thoroughbred breed and whatnot. So it's like there's sanctions and stuff that they in theory should be able to apply and like demands that they could make. But yeah, I think that like the trainers that are publicizing the worst of the worst in horse sport just need to be destroyed, because they're going to end up tanking the sport and ruining it for all of the people that are not like them. And at this point, it's like I don't really see why we're protecting them, because there's people who could be winning and could be standing there in their place that are objectively better, even if they're not perfect. So I'm all here for just like absolutely just ripping the rug out from underneath these corrupt people's feet and just having them fall.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does seem like it's getting to be the time for that, really. I mean, we're seeing that in whistleblowing in so many different horse sports right now, and a push in general for better horse welfare, which can only be a good thing. The thing in racing, though, is that it's sort of a unique horse sport because it has, with the gambling, such a crossover into the non-horse world that no other horse sport has. So a lot of the opinions surrounding racing are coming from an uneducated point of view as far as knowledge of horses goes. And it seems that these uneducated people are in the majority as well. Whereas, equestrians who know about horses are in the minority. Do you think that this is going to have an effect on the possibility of making any changes to the way that racing is done?
Oh, for sure. I think that what we need to do is we need for the people that are like vehemently in support of everything racing has to stand for currently and think it needs more change and thinks the horses who love their jobs. I think we need to run campaigns that like show how horses are supposed to live and like show horses interacting with each other in a field and like how calm they are, and then kind of like have a mirror image of like the horses in the stalls doing stress behaviors, and then maybe also compare it to like what zoo animals do, because I think that would paint a way clearer picture for people who are in denial. And then I think that another way to look at it for the people who are vehemently against racing would be to humanize the racehorse trainers who are doing things right and put a spotlight on them and show what they do for their horses, especially if they take them home and they're turning them out, show their everyday day-to-day schedule, show how their horses are responding versus the really stressed ones, and how they go through the whole process, and humanize them and show the lives that their horses live when they're good lives to live, and look through that lens. And then I also think that another important thing for everyone to consider, regardless of whether or not you like racing or not, such a huge money-making industry that employs so many people, that horse welfare aside, if we were to completely scrap that industry, the fallout economically and for people with jobs, and like I'm going to also point out the fact that a lot of the people who work in the racehorse industry are immigrants and people of color. It would be a devastating loss, and you'd have all of these families and these people whose entire livelihood is highly specialized and specific to racing, who would not be able to take care of themselves. And I know that some people who are really militant animal rights people are like, I don't care, they deserve it, they're horse abusers. But it's like, no, like the grooms and a lot of the people working the day-to-day, even if they feel sad for the horses and they know that it's not great, they love them. They do love them, and they do their best to give them the best case scenario, even if they can't control everything. And even if they are complicit in abuse because they're not aware of it, they're still trying to survive. And I think that's where we need to have a little bit more compassion, where it's like some people feel trapped in the situations they're in, whether they consciously realize it or not, because they don't see a way out. So it's such a complex issue, and I think the horse welfare is really important, but I also think we need to consider the fallout of if the industry were to collapse, because you'd suddenly have all of these people whose entire livelihood is tied to racing and who don't necessarily have another job. And then like where are all the horses gonna go, you know, like especially if it was like an immediate ban, like what a lot of people want, then you have all these like hundreds of thousands of horses, and it's like who's taking all these really highly fit young horses who have stress problems and other, like they're not the horse that the average non-horse person can take and just jump into getting horses. And even if we're gonna pretend they can, are there really like hundreds of thousands of homes that are willing to step up and take all these horses? No, like there's already an overpopulation problem. So from a standpoint of that, like we need to like either be looking at it like where it's like, even if your end goal is to have the industry collapse, the way you should be wanting that to go about is like a gradual phasing out of it, and like harm reduction and improving welfare practice where you can, instead of acting like that's like not a loss. Like I find a lot of people get really stubborn in their advocacy where they're like, no, it needs to be a full ban or it's not good enough. And it's like, okay, but if you could immediately change the horses' welfare right now and even mildly improve their day-to-day life, why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to make their lives better where they can, and make their lives like even just that little bit more tolerable? Why is that not good enough for the time being? Because you're not going to get your immediate ban right this second, but if you ask for less, you're more likely to at least get that one step closer. And harm reduction, whether people want to admit to it or not, harm reduction is a step closer to the end goal of banning the industry if that is your goal. But it would also provide the opportunity for people to see how those changes benefit the horses, and they might end up changing their perspective on the industry as a result by realizing, hey, like this is way better than I thought it would be, and the horses look happier. So I think that a huge educational campaign is needed on either side to help convince people that there's need for change, but also show that it is like a salvageable industry, and also humanize the people within it so that it's not so easy for people to go, these are evil, abusive people who hate horses and who don't care about them and who just view them as like pawns and vehicles for money. Because that might be true for the people who are making bank, but a lot of the people who are in the racing industry are like these mom and pop businesses that are barely breaking even. So they're really not in it for the money. And like they might not be doing everything right, but their money is it's certainly not financially motivated when they're barely breaking even. They just do it because they love horses and it's like the industry that they grew up in and it's important to them.
Yeah, like I feel like it'd be like comparing your average horse owner to the Grand Prix jumpers that are making $20,000 when they win. Like not everybody's going and making $1 million every race.
Yeah. It's like comparing a locally family owned grocer to like Walmart and trying to act like they're both as corrupt, which is like no.
Yeah. And it is easy to look from an educated point of view of I know scientifically what is best for horses and I can look at the data and I can say that the things that are happening on the racetrack are not good for horses, just scientifically. I can look at that from an educated point of view and I can say, well, these people must be bad people then because these things are clearly, to me, not good for horses. But just because I'm educated on something, that doesn't mean that somebody else is. And I think we have to have a lot of grace with other people
Yeah.
and kindness in how we educate people and make sure that for the betterment of the sport and the people in it, that education comes from a place of love and not from a place of hate. And I do think that in the
Yeah.
equestrian world in general, that's something that we struggle with.
Yeah, I think also that like the nuance is important. Like you can talk about why what someone is doing is bad without being like you're a terrible, irredeemable person who hates
Mm,
horses and abuses horses. You're so awful. You should be in jail. And it's like if we approach it with that mindset, it's like why are we even pushing for change if we're approaching it with the belief that these people aren't salvageable and that they can't
mm,
do better? Like the entire reason why we push for reform is because we believe people can do better. And I also think with like horse racing and then also like even breed show circuits, I think an important way to look at it is like they're like echo chambers. If you grow up in them and that's your only experience with horses, you quite literally don't know that there's other options in a lot of cases. And then when people come at you and they're just like attacking you and being mean to you, and making it this highly personal thing where they're insulting how you feel about your horses and you literally don't know another way, then it's hard to be receptive because then you get defensive. And like, I mean, I get frustrated with people who gloat about beating the crap out of their horses and like proudly defend it because then there is a lack of accountability.
mm,
And I'll say that it's wrong, but I think like no matter what it's important to like critique someone's behavior like and why what they are actually doing is wrong, why those actions are wrong, rather than starting to label them as people and
mm.
just like go on like a character assassination essentially, because people can do bad things without doing it from a place of malice. And I think that's a really important way of looking at it, especially if we want them to make changes. And also just like providing information. Like I think that's the other thing is like we do need to share alternatives and we do need to show why there's need for change. And I think like the sharing of studies and like infographics and whatnot is great for that. So yeah, I think that that's where we should start, and also just like really keep in mind how much of an echo chamber some of these industries can be, and like look at it from that perspective where it's like not some people are, yes, but not all of the people in these industries are being willfully ignorant. Like a lot of them have just been taught stuff that is completely wrong. And honestly, I relate to that because that's what happened to me in the Arabian show circuit, and
Mm.
it was an echo chamber. And when everyone around you is doing the same thing and they're all okay with it, especially when you go into it in your childhood or when you're very young, it becomes really hard to just like actually think about the fact that like there might be that much wrong information being shared.
Mm. Yeah, and when you're confronting somebody about the thing that they're doing that you believe to be wrong, it's often very emotionally charged.
Oh
If
yeah.
you really believe that this is so terrible for these horses, and maybe it is, it's hard to approach that from a point of view of love and understanding for the person when all you see is the action and you can be just so vehemently opposed to that action. So I guess that is something to think about too. Like I guess if I was talking to a big lick trainer, I don't know how I would respond. so, but Before we get any further, I just want to ask our listeners, if you're enjoying the episode so far and want it to reach other equestrians, please take the time to go ahead and just leave a review. I know every podcast asks for reviews, but it really does help us out, probably way more than you would think. So please, if you're enjoying it, go ahead and take a quick moment, leave a review on whatever podcast platform you're using, and let us know what you think. It would really mean a lot.
And it does get frustrating when they're like deliberately rejecting information. I understand that because I think it goes both ways. Like, you can get compassion fatigue, and it's very frustrating to perpetually be dealing with people who are causing horses harm and then not being receptive at all to considering that. And I lose my patience sometimes, but I think that it's important to not I lose my patience with the types of Clinton Anderson style trainers where essentially they are gloating about how much they stress horses out and talking about if this horse freaks out when I'm teaching this to the point where they get injured or died, they deserve it if they're that stupid. Those people I don't feel the need to be as patient with, because how belligerently cruel their behavior is, you know that they are not really in a place where they're going to be receptive to when you offer them information. So I'm a little bit more blunt with people like that, but I think if you walk into it without an expectation, without even giving the person a chance, then it's a problem. I also think too that people responding defensively to information that you generally share. I've done a lot of posts on horse racing and other industries talking about the problems in them, and people often respond defensively. And that's a normal response when your sense of reality is starting to be cracked by what other people are sharing, regardless of how nicely or objectively it's put, and regardless of whether or not it's a personal attack. And they might do it through the lens of, you're calling all of us abusive because, for example, saying we need more bit regulations, the types of bitting rigs that people use in show jumping, a lot of them should not be sold on the market. Some people take that as, I hate all bits. You are an abuser if you take bits, even if that is, or if you use bits. And even if that's not what's being said, because they are viewing it through the lens of being very defensive because their trainer or themselves probably uses some of the types of gadgets that you're critiquing, and then they respond defensively. But I think that even having that response, that doesn't mean that we should stop doing it, because that's part of the process of accepting information that's hard to hear. I was initially really defensive and closed off to a lot of the information that I now accept, and that level of defensiveness was just an external representation of how much reading what they said rocked my world, and how uncomfortable and raw and vulnerable and sad it made me feel. And I wasn't ready to unpack all of those emotions right then and there. But what they said did plant a seed that eventually led me to looking into things more on my own time and coming to the same realization. So even if the person doesn't respond well initially, it can still bring change.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Last question. As a behavior consultant, what is one small, easy step that almost all horse owners can take to make their horses' lives better?
I think that looking at it from a harm reduction standpoint is one of the best things we can do. For example, rather than feeling stuck where it's I live in the middle of the city, there's no places locally to me that have full-time group turnout. How can you reduce the harm? Even how can you reduce harm to your horse? Even if it's literally just taking them for a walk every day, where you let them pick the route, you let them pick at grass and graze, and you do stuff like that to enrich their life as much as you can in the moment while you look for other ways to improve. So I'd say that day-to-day management is one of the most important things. Even if you don't want to change anything in your ride, I always start with management, because that's how the horse is spending the vast majority of their life. Even if their rides are terrible and you're really mean to them in their rides, if they have really good management, it allows them more space to decompress from that stress. And it's also encompassing how they spend most of their time. So they might have a really bad association with their ridden work when people are really cruel to them in rides. But at the bare minimum, if their management is good, they're going to be more resilient to having to deal with that stress, because they're not entering those training situations with as much pent-up anxiety from living conditions that aren't fair to them. So I think people should really try to find management scenarios that allow for as much turnout as possible. If there's no places that do group turnout, Shared fence lines are better than nothing. Having access to an in and out paddock so your horse can walk out of their stall whenever they want, even if it's a small one, that I've seen improves welfare a lot for horses, especially ones who have trauma associated with feeling trapped in a stall. Also having free choice access to forage, and by free choice I don't mean like feeding it to them loose necessarily. You can feed it in slow feed nets, and if your barn doesn't typically do this, I would do things like ask them, hey, if I pre-stuff like a full bale net for my horse that will last them several days for the average horse, like at least probably 2 to 3 days, can you just like put it in, like, can I put it in their stall and then you don't have to throw them hay? And like ask stuff like that. Or if I buy my own net, will you fill it so that my horse doesn't eat their hay too quickly and that they constantly have access to hay? So the management stuff is where I think the average owner can do the biggest difference for their horse's overall welfare. As for like riding and stuff, I think the best way that people can help their horses is advocate for your horse. If your trainer is suggesting something that makes you uncomfortable, stand your ground. If you own the horse, like I understand if you're leasing or it's a lesson horse, it's much more difficult because you ultimately don't have the final say. But if it's your horse, you do. You can say no to things. And good trainers, even if they don't agree with your stance, they should at least allow you that autonomy to be like, I'm not comfortable doing this with my horse. Can we try something else? And if they freak out at you and like threaten to kick you out of the barn or something, I think that's a sign that's probably not someone that you want to learn from, because if their ego is that fragile and that's how they react, you're not really going to learn anything worthwhile from them, because they're going like it's very much about them and maintaining that ego. So like stand your ground, advocate for your horse, say no if you don't want to use a certain bit, or if you don't want to whip your horse for doing something wrong, say no. And like, no, I'm not comfortable with that, I want to do something else. And like if the trainer is receptive, you can even send them like studies and articles, and it might change their perspective, because you'd be surprised. There's some people that I honestly really admire because they have been in the horse world way longer than I, and they've done things the same way for a lot of time, but they're curious. They want to learn. They want to read these new studies, even if it's being given to them from someone who has less years of experience than them. And I think that those are the best type of mentors, honestly. Like it is such an admirable trait for someone to be open to learning and like opening to listening to their clients or their employees' considerations and actually looking into it before immediately shutting them down, or at the very least like having a conversation. If someone suggests something that is objectively untrue to me, I talk to them about it and I'm like, here's why I'm not comfortable with that. Like the amount of times I've had clients who suggested using training aids that I really don't agree with, or I've even had people's vets suggest these types of things. And when it's a vet or someone that has that much schooling, it becomes a really difficult issue, because it's like I'm speaking out against the expertise of someone who is literally a doctor. But I sent yeah, like I send them resources though, and I'm like, look, this is why I don't agree with this. This is why I think it's going to be more damaging to your horse. I respect the fact that your vet is the veterinary professional, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a training professional when it comes to horses. And I think that this is not going to do what they think it is. And like people are infallible. They might have other good ideas, but people are ultimately like, they make mistakes. And then I just give them the information. I'm like, here you go. Take it or leave it. If you leave it and decide to do this thing that I don't agree with, you're going to have to do it on your own. I'm not going to support you in that. And because I don't think that it's the best for your horse, but you're welcome to do whatever you want. And yeah, giving people that autonomy too, I think is helpful. Like if you're in a position, like I'm in a more of a position of power as a trainer, because ultimately it's like, it's not a threat, but it's just letting my client know, like, here's a boundary I'm going to set. If you do this, it doesn't match my philosophy, and you're going to have to find a new trainer that is okay with that, because I'm not. And then it leaves them with a choice, and it's a choice that some people might not like and they might get defensive or offended by, but it's a choice nonetheless. So yeah, it's those little things. Advocate for your horse where you can. Even if your horse is stalled 24/7 right now, I'm not going to judge you. I'm just going to say that it is impactful to welfare. So if they're in that situation, what you're going to want to do is provide as much enrichment as possible, get them out of the stall as much as you possibly can, and then really look for a better situation long term wherever possible. But in the meantime, get them like some toys, get them some stuff to keep them busy. monitor their behavior accordingly, and just be really conscious of the fact that it's a very unnatural way to keep horses, and that you're going to want to keep that in mind so that you can limit the amount of impact it has to welfare.
Yeah, those are really great tips. I completely agree. I think that it's really important to just improve where you can, try your best, and try to just keep moving forward and staying educated as you can and everything. If anyone listening wants to connect with you and learn more about what you do and, um, learn more from you, where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram and TikTok under the same name, SD Equus, which is like SDEQUUS. I'm also on YouTube if you look up Milestone Equestrian or my name, Shelby Dennis. And then I'm also on Facebook under Milestone Equestrian. And then I have a Patreon channel with more in-depth tutorials, monthly Q&As, and behind-the-scenes type stuff that you can subscribe to. And that's just patreon.com/SDEquus. So yeah, those are the best places to find me. And it should have, and I also have a podcast called Making Milestones. I always forget to share that one. So depending on what your medium for learning is, there's a lot of different options, whether it's videos, written posts, or podcasts. So
Shelby, thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. I did too.
Yeah, I thought it was really productive, and yeah, I'm really was happy to have you on.
Yeah, same. I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for listening into this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something. If you'd like to go ahead and learn more about AHLERI and what we do and the products we make, I recommend checking out our Instagram. It's AHLERI Equine Products, AHLERI Equine Products on Instagram. You can also visit our website, AHLERI.com. And there you can find our Muzzle Butter at Ease Scent Stick, which is our science-backed, non-invasive, essential oils-based calming aid that applies right to their horse's nose that we developed to help horse owners take the first step towards prioritizing their horse's mental health just as much as they prioritize their horse's physical health. Until next time, see you guys later.